there's no such thing as a bad. I think it's intentionally contrarian, but there's no such thing as a bad answer from an LLM. It's just a bad question. And I was like, it kind of pivots the thought around. So as we explored that together, I think what we kind of realized is like if you think about how you used Google the very earliest of days and how you use it
Yeah,
now, you learned how to use the tool to
it's
get
true.
the best search results, right? And so like now, like as you get more and more familiar with these applications, right, with these LLMs and these underlying things, and they improve, we're going to meet at this convergence point where it's going to feel increasingly natural to you because you've adopted how you use it and the technology's gotten better.
Hey, Luca here. Welcome to a new episode of the Refactoring podcast, where every 2 weeks we interview a world class tech leader. Today's guest is Dennis Pilarinos, who is founder and CEO of Unblocked. With Dennis, we talked about his journey in tech, which is just incredible, starting from director roles at Microsoft and Amazon, then founding Bodybuild and later selling it to Apple, and eventually to these days where he founded Unblocked. And later we talked about Unblocked itself, which is one of the few developer AI tools that is specifically not about coding. So we talked about what problem it solves and the hardest tech challenges that the team has to work with. And finally, we discussed the future of dev tools because Dennis has founded not one but two companies about it. And this is a time of big transformation with MCP, AI agents, and more. So let's dive right into the action. Hi, Dennis. Welcome and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Luke. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so Dennis, you're the founder and CEO of Unblocked, which is one of the most used and loved AI dev tools. And before that, you had an incredible career because you founded Bodybuild, which I used, by the way, at my previous startup,
Oh, cool.
and sold it to Apple and had other stints as well at big tech before as a director at Microsoft and Amazon. So we usually start our interviews by asking guests about their journey in tech, but I'm afraid in your case we could do like an entire season just on that.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough.
So when you look back at your journey, what are the highlights that you remember the most fondly so far?
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, it reminds me that I have been building developer tools for the better part of 20 years,
Yeah.
and so I started off my career at Microsoft. I worked on something called the .NET Framework, which is a client-side API for folks who might not be familiar with it, and thought there'd be a natural transition from people building, cloud or from desktop applications to cloud hosted applications where developers could call APIs. And so I thought it'd be fun to kick off an incubation with a handful of friends that
Mm.
literally started off as a direct internet connection in my office. And so it's a fun story because we were in reviews with very, very senior executives of the company who felt that we were cannibalizing their existing on premise business by building this cloud platform. To give you a sense for how
Wow.
long ago this was, the
Yeah.
bookseller, Amazon, had just launched EC2 and S3 as beta services. And so we
Wow.
thought there was, it was an interesting opportunity. And so we went from this group of, radicals cannibalizing on premise licensing businesses to a few years later, that single machine plugged into a direct internet connection was now geographically distributed around the world. And we were all in on the cloud, and that became
Mm.
the Azure platform.
Wow.
And so that was an incredible experience for sure, going from the earliest days to seeing what infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, SaaS as a service, these kind of terms meant, and where the line was drawn, and what that meant for developers.
Yeah.
From there, I spent a little bit of time at Amazon. Spent a couple of years there, taking my passion for mobile and web and marrying it with my experience in cloud. We built the Silk web browser, which is this cloud accelerated browser. As that project wrapped up, I left and wanted to explore what the iOS ecosystem looked like.
Mm.
So Amazon is predominantly an Android-based platform, and so I had dusted off my old Mac Mini and tried to build a very simple application, very simple workflow: Git push, have a build, have it deployed to my device. Shouldn't be very hard. Shockingly difficult. And
Yeah.
so a couple of friends and I decided to start a company to build a CI platform, mobile app developers, and that became Buddy Build. And so Buddy Build went from inception to acquisition in 3 years. Apple bought the company.
Wow.
I worked there for about a year and a half. And yeah, and when that time wrapped up, I decided to take a little bit of time off and start Unblocked. But yeah, I guess like if I take a step back, I mean, thematically, I think my career or the things that I've worked on are a consequence of the fact that I'm a uh, very mediocre developer at best, and like a very impatient person. And so typically I'm just like, why is it so hard to do this? Like, just like these frustration points, I think that most developers feel. And I just become obsessed with kind of solving them. So,
Yeah.
calling a cloud hosted API, being able to have a very straightforward workflow as a mobile developer, and now Unblocked is like, I don't like having to wait to get the information I need as I'm building my applications. I don't want to bother my coworkers. I don't want to dig through documentation. I just will like want to ask a
Yeah.
question and get a response immediately, right? So yeah, I'm just like I have these terrible behaviors of being very impatient and very mediocre as a developer. So
Hey, before we continue, I want to tell you that today's episode is brought to you by Swarmia, the engineering intelligence platform that serves some of the best software companies in the world, from startups like Lovable and Superhuman to scale ups like Miro and Webflow, all the way to Fortune 500s. By combining data from all the tools your product and engineering teams are already using, Swarmia gives everyone in your organization visibility into where engineering time is going, the progress of cross-team initiatives, and the bottlenecks that are slowing teams down. So what makes Swarmia special is that it combines proven software development metrics with feedback from developer experience surveys. It's a platform engineers actually want to use, not just another monitoring tool they have to tolerate. And instead of throwing you into a bottomless pit of data, Swarmia automatically identifies patterns and delivers actionable signals to you, complete with practical steps you can take to improve. So get 20% off your first year by booking a demo at swarmia.com/refactoring. So it is true what they say that laziness, impatience are great drivers to create eventually great products.
yeah, yeah, for sure. I think, and some level of stubbornness and
Yes.
persistence. So yeah, you need a certain amount of like bullheadedness, I would argue.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, you did big tech to startups back to back multiple times. So, did you do you have any things, lessons, culture, processes that you learned at, for example, Microsoft or Amazon or Apple that you brought with you in your startups, or and vice versa, possibly?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my career, I was very fortunate to have opportunities to work pretty closely with the founder CEOs of these
Yeah.
companies. And so within the context of Microsoft, I got to work very closely with Bill on occasion, and then at Amazon with Jeff. And so there's definitely aspects of those experiences that played in Buddy Build, and certainly in Unblocked as well. So I think at Microsoft, they are one of the best, certainly at my time there and the teams that I worked with. So it's hard to extrapolate for everyone, but they
Mm,
are one of the best at like actually building software at scale. Like they are
mm,
a true software company. They have like well understood processes for how things work. And so, I graduated university and got a master's in actual building real software, right? From inception to shipping and maintaining it,
yeah.
managing it, a new version. Amazon has these well-known leadership principles, or they're well
Yeah.
publicized. So these leadership principles, it was the thing that I learned at Amazon is that they are not just words that are written on a wall. They are referred to and a true statement of their culture. Like if you want to know what it's like to work at Amazon, just read those leadership principles because you will hear them referenced and alluded to explicitly or and implicitly day in day out. So having a very strong culture. Specifically, I think there's a couple of them that really stuck out with us, and we've kind of adopted our version of them. But like this hyper obsession on customers,
Mm,
so that's definitely one. A strong bias for action is another, and this customer obsession. Sorry, customer obsession is sorry. So I'll start it again. Customer obsession being number one, bias for action, and then ownership, like strong ownership of kind of what you work on. So those are the three that like there's a whole bunch of other ones that were really good.
yeah.
And then I think Apple. does this incredible thing of building delightful user experiences for their products, and has this multi-year vision of how these things kind of all tie together in a way that you don't see coming. And then when it
Mm,
all kind of lights up, it just feels like inevitable, but like shockingly surprising. And
yeah.
so there's certainly aspects of that that I learned at Apple that we're incorporating in Unblocked for sure as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is interesting to me by listening to you talking about these aspects is how sometimes we imagine like these big corporations as being all kind of similar, right? They're big companies, while instead you mentioned very different things, very different parts of their DNAs that in a way I think they're even complementary, right? You mentioned process and maybe operational excellence at Microsoft, culture and principles at Amazon, this ability on creating delightful experiences at Apple. They're all different things, but they come together. They're useful by using them together.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's a very astute observation.
Yeah. So, which leads us to Unblocked. So, Unblocked, well, one of the things that strikes me is that it's one of the few AI developer tools within all the hype that is specifically not about coding. So, what is Unblocked about, and what problem does it solve?
Yeah, that's a super reasonable question. Yeah, it's actually funny. I've been giving a talk recently calling it, that's titled "Solving Real Problems for Development
Yeah,
Teams Using AI," because I think there is a lot of hype around, and and it's well deserved. I think some of the technology that's available today and the rate at which it's changing is absolutely game changing for the industry. So the problem that we're trying to solve is really contextualization of the problem of your code base of your application. So at the highest level, there's a bunch of tribal knowledge that exists
yeah,
about most code bases. And that tribal knowledge is scattered across your code base and Slack and Notion and Jira and Confluence and Google Docs and Linears, all these different places. And so the way that, the core problem is that people have to spend a huge amount of time trying to get that information. It's incredibly time consuming and quite painful. So instead, actually, the way that they do it is that they interrupt their coworkers, right? Either by tapping them on the shoulder or sending them Slack messages, or they spend a bunch of time like digging through these kind of data sources.
yeah,
And so what Unblock does is it takes the source code and augments it with the data and discussions that makes it gives it a very easy way for you to ask a question and get a response very quickly. So instead of having to wait a long period of time or risk feeling kind of silly by asking a quote unquote dumb question, you get this kind of expert that knows every change in every discussion that's ever been had, and it's available at your fingertips. And within seconds, you get answers. So
yeah,
that's what we're trying to do. And so, if you take a step way back, and I always, when we give this talk, there's this slide which we start the talk off, and I feel almost awkward doing it because you're talking to software professionals. But it's
yeah,
a great way to frame it, right? If you think about how software is built, there's really three high level stages. The first is gathering context, right? Why did we
yeah,
do this? How does it work?
yeah,
What happens if I were to make these changes? Once you have that context, then you can actually go start writing code, right? And that's where you're using your Cursor and Windsurf and Copilot, any of those things to actually write the code. Then once the code is written, you deploy, operate, monitor, and you do all the stuff that happens as it's in runtime. So
yeah,
what Unblocked predominantly spends time on is helping you gather that context, and
yeah,
increasingly, to this kind of Apple vision of like having multiple products that create this delightful experience. Actually, we think that there's a lot of tools and there's like a lot of capability in that second stage, but I think there's still quite a bit of opportunity in the third stage as well. So our goal ultimately, actually, here's my favorite anecdote. One of our customers, this VP of engineering, who's known for hiring like top tier engineers, said it took one of his top engineers 5 days to write 12 lines of code. Right. And so, as software developers, even as a mediocre software developer, 12
yeah,
lines of code should take a few minutes if you know what code to write.
yes,
But when you
yes,
don't, right, that's where you're spending all this time in these discussions and stuff. That's what we want. 12 lines of code should take seconds or, less than that, even with these days. So that's what Unblocked does.
yeah. This really resonates with my experience. I remember looking at an industry report that said that on average, developers actually spend less than 20% of their time, coding sometimes as little as like 10% of their time. So all these expectations of productivity gains coming from pure like AI coding IDEs and tools like Cursor and stuff are necessarily like capped by the fact that people spend time on other stuff. So there has to be a huge opportunity in tapping into the rest of the overhead that prevents people from spending more time on actual building stuff.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so we want you to spend more time writing code and less time like, digging for information.
Yeah, and one of the things that I feel by looking at this incredible progression of AI and all these models getting smarter and smarter is that uh, the bottleneck to me that prevents from unlocking even more value is not necessarily like in the level of intelligence, but in how good we are at providing context to these models. Because it feels like these models are incredibly capable when prompted right, when given the right set of information. And even if the progress stopped here for like 10 years, we'll probably keep discovering ways of using them for many years to come. While we are still like early in the game of understanding how to pass more information to them and using them in real time. So you work at the forefront of this. So what's your take? Is really this like the game at the frontier right now, or is something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very easy to get caught in the specifics, but if you take like just think about how the real world works, right? To the degree that you have context, you're going to get better output and better outcomes, right? And so, like, if you take any engineer or any person doing any work and say, "Go and do this thing," and they go and do it, and you look at the outcome, and you're like, "Oh, that's not expected at all." Like, how did you come up with this solution? And they have a set of assumptions that might be incorrect. So to the degree that you
Yeah,
can like clarify those assumptions up front, which is like, hey, you're a framer for a house. Go build a house. And they build this single story house and they're very happy with it. And you're like, no, no, no. I have like an extended family and it needs to have multiple floors and so on. Like they didn't have any context as to the problem they were trying to solve.
yeah,
So what Unblock does is it introduces the context that's specific to your application to both the AIs and the people who are writing code, right? So increasingly, I think what we're seeing is that the AIs can help you write a bunch of code,
hmm,
but they are as limited to the same constructs that people are, right?
yeah,
Which is to the degree that you can provide meaningful context, they're going to get you much better results. And so you know, one of the things that Unblock does is provide this contextual code intelligence, right? And so we can plug it into things like Cursor and Windsurf and Copilot, and it is game changing when you give these AIs the context that they need, as if they were an experienced engineer who's worked on that team for a long time. You get mind blowing results as compared to without that information. And it's the same thing for a person. So, I think the evolution right now is lots of things can write code. How do you make those things intelligent? How do you make those things contextually aware what code to write?
yeah. And I remember speaking with other companies who build products that AI products that also fetch like real time content from different APIs and tools, and they all mentioned the fact that in the like popular opinion, common opinions, like these RAG architectures, this architecture for fetching context should be some kind of commodity, while instead it's incredibly hard to figure out what kind of content to extract, what is relevant versus what is not. And so you need sometimes still to implement very custom things to do the best work. So is this technically challenging for you, or and something you spend a lot of time into?
Incredibly challenging, right? So, like, especially for a developer audience, right?
Yeah,
So, we spent a lot of time trying to reduce the introduction of hallucinations, right? So,
yeah,
it's remarkable. Every first question that a user asks in Unblocked that I've ever seen, it's incredibly consistent. Like I would bet large sums of money that the first question that people are going to ask are something they know the answer to,
hmm,
right? And so what they're doing is they're vetting to say like, well, how good is this thing? And so that's how they start to build trust with the product, right?
yeah,
And so our goal is to like make sure that we give you high quality answers specific to kind of the high bar that you would have as an engineer. So
yeah,
if you work backwards from that, which is like you can't be wrong, right? And it has to be
yeah,
contextually relevant. There's a bunch of like underpinnings or characteristics that are required. So knowing who the person is, who they work with, what they've recently worked on, how that question fits in relative to the architecture of the system. There's a whole bunch of really technical problems that are required for you to give like really, really good answers. That's just like, what an end user wants. But then there's the organization in which that end user actually works in. So
Yeah.
one of the, fun problems to solve is how do you make sure that that person gets really high quality answers, but only based on the data that they have access to,
Yeah.
right? So like, when I worked at Apple, there's all sorts of projects that were going on that I didn't know about, wasn't supposed to know about. And so if you deployed Unblocked at Apple without kind of a permissions aware
Yeah.
architecture, Apple would never roll that product out. Like there's zero chance, right? Because then you just basically erode all of the information barriers that they have to meet the needs of their business. So knowing who you are and what information you have access to at like runtime is its own fun problem into itself. So you can use Unblocked in a security conscious organization and not have any concern. So there's all sorts of like technical fun problems that you have
Yeah.
to solve with these types of products.
Love this. A lot to unpack. So I want to ask you about hallucinations because this is probably like the number one reason why we sometimes hear that organizations don't fully trust AI agents or LLMs because they're not reliable. They create things from out of thin air. So do you think, first of all, this is an inherent and inevitable problem with these models, and second, that you can actually contain and mitigate the problem by creating systems and architectures around these models to prevent this from happening?
Yeah, so I think I mean it's not a very difficult thought exercise. The hallucination rate of even the models that we use as consumers, let alone what Unblocked does or any other tool, a year ago versus today is
Mm.
dramatically better. And so
Mm.
like today's the worst that it's ever going to be, right? Tomorrow it'll be better and the day after that it'll be better. And that's the evolution of both the underlying models and the techniques that we use to kind of sharpen those skills. So just like any new technology, there's some sharp edges when it's kind of first born or put into meaningful application. But over time, those things kind of get smoothed out. And so, um, unquestionably, we had to do more work a year ago to solve these problems than
Mm.
we did now. And it's because everyone recognizes it's a problem. That's on the technical side. On the human side, actually had this fascinating conversation with one of our customers who works at Travel Park, also
Mm.
a fellow Italian for what it's worth. And so Luca, his name was Luca as well. He had this
Nice.
interesting perspective. Yeah, he must be a good guy.
Of
He had
course.
this he had this really interesting perspective, which was that there's no such thing as a bad. I think it's intentionally contrarian, but there's no such thing as a bad answer from an LLM. It's just a bad question.
Mm.
And I was like, it kind of pivots the thought around. So it's full credit to him. And his, as we explored that together, I think what we kind of realized is like if you think about how you used Google in the very earliest of days and how you use it
Yeah,
now, you learned how to use the tool to
it's
get
true.
the best search results. Right. And
Yeah,
so like now, like as you get more and more familiar with these applications, right, with these LLMs and these underlying things, and they improve, we're going to meet at this convergence point where it's going to feel increasingly natural to you because you've adopted how you use it, and the technology's gotten better. So, I think it's a problem that does get solved.
yeah, it's true. I think there's a big element of understanding how to use these tools. The Google example, I think, was perfect. I remember a quote from a recent interview of Demi Hassabis from Google that he said that he believes that probably humans hallucinate even more than LLMs, but LLMs hallucinate in a more surprising way that is easy to spot for humans, and so it catches our attention.
Yeah.
Which makes me think also another analogy is when you use LLMs for coding, it was especially too little time ago, now they make less and less errors. But by the way, they used to introduce bugs, not so many with respect to, I mean, human bugs, but they were very different. So they were like harder to spot. They were stranger, using libraries in the wrong way, bugs that people did not make. So I think sometimes it's just a matter of they do different things, they seem worse, but it's just that they're different.
Yeah. That's right. I totally agree with that. I think that's a great way of describing it.
Yeah. So you work on an AI enabled, AI powered tool. You are an AI company by all means. So has AI also changed meaningfully how your organization work, how your team works as structured and uh, your day to day as a
Yeah,
company?
for sure. Yeah, unquestionably. I think it's like there's any number of reasons that we should be using the underlying technology.
Dog
So
fooding all the way.
yeah, for sure. So we use like as we bring on new folks into the organization, they use Unblocked, and like a lot of their feedback is quickly incorporated into the product, right? Because
Yes.
I think as anyone who builds anything, you quickly lose the forest for the trees, and getting that
Yes.
fresh set of eyes is incredible. Um, yeah, it's an interesting thing. It's unclear to me. There's always like this ongoing debate, which is like, to what degree does AI reduce the number of jobs? Right. I think is this kind of
Yes.
underlying tension. And so we'll go back to the construction analogy, right? Which is
Mm.
when I think of people who work in construction. Let's go with the framers again. You know, when you frame a building, at one point you're probably using a hammer, and then at some point you use a nail gun. Now,
Mm.
when you with the introduction of the nail gun, did you reduce the number of days that you worked? No, right? Like you just were able to create more
More.
buildings. So I think that's kind of like how that works. And so, anyone is like, oh, it's going to reduce the number of people, I think are kind of for very, depending on the vertical, we have a very, very long roadmap of things that we want to go and do, right? That roadmap isn't really finite. I think we're going to continue to hire people, and I just like the rate at which they can, get those things done will increase.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I completely agree with this. I also think people get somewhat scared by some uh, supposed singularity that at some point people think will happen, where we all of a sudden we have like AGI, like the day before we don't have AGI, the day after we have it. I don't know, and then it is able to do all the things that we humans do, and then some. Uh, I don't know if you believe that this will be like an actual tipping point, or or a gradual evolution where we just be more and more productive at doing things, and so we will not even feel that there will be a transition. Uh, what do you think will happen? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm not the best futurist. So like I have like, a personal perspective and opinion on it. But I'm a very pragmatic person. My intuition is like, if AGI comes to full fruition, where there's a machine that's more sentient and aware than us, then I think, uh, developer productivity and efficiency is probably the least of our concerns.
Probably
It's
yes.
like, yeah, I think there's a lot scarier things that we should be thinking about and kind of focused on.
Yeah,
So yeah, that
that's a
that
great
I think
answer.
is like, it becomes existential at that point.
Yeah. So speaking of developer productivity and developer tools, by your own admission, you have worked all your career basically on developer tools, and this is a time of big transformation with MCPs, AI agents. You have founded two companies about developer tools. So what does the future look like to you? So let's restrict the scope. Not let's not talk about AGI, but
Yeah,
do
sure.
let's talk about like developer workflows. So do you have like opinions about where this space is going in terms of how engineers are going to work? How are workflows changing? Maybe things that you're already witnessing today.
For sure. I think certainly the things that I've seen today, if you're starting a greenfield project, which I've, in my career, have had the opportunity to do just a few times.
Yeah.
I think certainly the state of the world today, the tools that you're using are incredible at like taking folks who are mediocre developers, right, and getting something up
Yes.
and running. If you work at a large institution with a legacy code base that has had hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of like person hours in it, I think those tools really struggle to be kind of effective there, as effective as they would be on a new project. I think that'll increasingly change, right? I think one of the observations we talked about is that to the degree that either a person or an AI has context,
Mm.
you're going to get better outcomes. And so I think that's kind of what happens. Is right now you have someone who's really, really good, but kind of young and naive, I would say. And so just
Yeah.
like rams through a bunch of stuff and doesn't really have any experience, meaningful experience to be like,
Yeah.
these are the patterns that you follow and these are why. And, these are the types of issues. So I think about that all within the context of like writing code. But there's going to be more and more and more code written. I love this kind of thought. I don't know it's strictly true. And as a pedantic developer, I'm going to cross my fingers as I say it. But I heard this earlier last week. There's probably more technical debt that has been written in the last 6 months than there has been in the history of software. And
Yeah, I read
so,
it too.
yeah, and I was like, I don't know that it's strictly correct, but it's instinctually feels right.
Yeah.
But I think we'll resolve that over time. And I think again, context, certainly my perspective on it, will help. But then second order, I think, and this is what we're trying to accomplish with Unblocked. If you think about how problems are solved in the real world, like application level problems at runtime, right? There's two things that you need in order to kind of debug an issue. One is all the contextual knowledge, like that's typically captured in static data sources, so documents, source
Mm.
code, Slack conversations, and then obviously you need the runtime instrumentation of that application as well. But when you combine those two things together, and you have a very smart, machine, effectively, I don't know if it's fully AGI, but a very smart machine, when bad things happen, all of a sudden you can respond to those things very, very quickly. So,
Mm.
as an example of that, we have a feature called autonomous CI triage, right? And
Mm.
so, again, the pragmatism and the mediocrity, and maybe some domain experience. Um, the two things that I certainly hate, and I think most people hate doing, is like writing tests. Lots of tools to help you do that. And then the other is understanding the cryptic messages that come out of a build when it fails, right? When your build system,
Yes.
like, you're just
Can
like,
relate. Yeah.
yeah. And so you're just like digging through, trying to understand so on and so forth. And so this is kind of one of the things that we've actually solved with Unblocked, and it demonstrates this idea of like there's something that happens at runtime that is abnormal. Your build fails. So think of the runtime in this case as your build system, and the build fails. And so what Unblocked is able to do is understand the build failure relative to the runtime and that full context, right? All the documents, all the
Mm.
Slack conversations, what have you, and say, here's the reason why it failed, root cause analysis, and then actually propose a fix, right? And so, from an end user's perspective, these are the types of things that I do not like to do that machines can do
Yes.
very, very well for me, right?
Yeah.
And so, if I think about, autonomous CI triage is our kind of like toe in the water, and people love this feature. Like
Yes.
the idea that I can like my PR is broken and I get in the pull request, here's the root cause and here's the proposed solution. You can hit, yeah, go ahead and fix it. Think about what
Yeah.
you could do. Like you're like page load time has regressed, or this Kubernetes cluster has exceeded a certain utilization rate, and you can say, well, the reason is because of these code changes and these related Slack conversations, and here's some bugs. Oh, and by the way, all of that factors into a solution that Unblocked thinks that you should go and roll out.
Yeah.
So where do things go? Like, I think, kind of to this Apple example, right? Like the problem that we're solving right now of surfacing that tribal knowledge is step one.
Yeah.
Step two is like integrations with increasing runtime so that you can actually build um, these end-to-end kind of workflows to address these issues that no one really likes solving.
Yeah, removing toil and grunt work from developers so they can focus maybe on higher value and more
Yeah,
creative stuff.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So another trend that I'm seeing, and I wanted to pick your brains because you're working exactly on this, is when I speak with teams that use AI also for surfacing information with tools like Unblocked and getting help with docs, many people tell me that they feel like an incentive to write more docs in a way, even with the help of AI, but because there is this feeling that they're now more useful, right? Because they can be picked up by AI, then that can do more things with them as opposed to people who maybe cannot be bothered to read the full thing. And so maybe some surprising aspect of using more AI may be we will create actually more documentation, we will write more stuff because AI will need to use it.
Thoughts?
Do
Yeah.
you, do you agree? Do you,
You know,
do you
I
see
said
this in
it's
your
funny.
customers?
I
Yeah.
said, yeah. So I said, The two things that developers hate doing are like writing tests and debugging build failures.
Yeah.
The only thing that I think they hate more than that is writing docs.
Yeah.
Like, I was actually wrong. Like on the tail end of that, I was like, no, actually, yeah. So I think that's a good intention, but probably not super well practiced.
Okay.
And so maybe, I mean, I think that'd be
Maybe. I hope will happen, but I'm not sure.
I think it's unlikely. And so I think
Okay.
actually I wrote a little snippet on this. One of the things that we found, there's two parts to this thing. First is I've never met a company who's like, our docs are perfect. They are
Yeah,
up to
me
date
too.
and well organized. Just does not exist, right?
Yeah.
Uh, like, and so from a product perspective, if we're like, look, you need to write a bunch of documentation before Unblock can be good, that's
Yeah.
that's a complete showstopper for
Not
us.
gonna happen.
No.
Yeah.
And so we do a bunch of things to actually improve the quality of the documentation that you walk in with completely in the back end. It's completely transparent to you, but the knowledge base that you get with Unblocked is dramatically better
Yeah.
as a consequence of it. So that's one. Two, um, documentation is a great way for us to codify knowledge. But one of the things that's different between like lexical search and semantic search is that semantics are, the result of the construction of a bunch of different
Yeah.
related but like not strongly connected information. And so I would actually argue kind of in a contrarian way that which is like you actually need less docs. Like I think
Yeah.
developer documentation could actually be dead because if you take the source code and any of the conversations that sit beside it and you ask the semantic engine to like provide an answer for you, it does an incredibly good job. So I don't
Yeah.
know what more like the value that you would get in terms of the response versus the effort required to write those docs seems questionable to me,
Yeah.
especially as time progresses.
Love this take. So I have a final question that is you work with AI dev tools like all the time. So if you had to set up a new like development team and to the maximum efficiency, how would you work in terms of developer process? How would you use AI in the very step of the development process?
That's a great question. I think the fundamentals kind of stay the same,
Mm.
like the core fundamentals. Like when I think of development process, like I still think you need like strong CI, maybe because of my background and bias or whatever.
Yeah.
Like I think you need. I think you need, like you'd be surprised. I have some horror stories around large organizations who had no idea what pull requests were. But I think the fundamentals like of a pull request in a CI process. Um, I think the tools that we're building today, not just Unblocked, but just in the industry in general, is going to help accelerate those like first principles or those best practices. Um, One of the things that we do is we, as a Buddy Build user, I think a lot of people love the end user experience. Like we took a lot of the complexity away of building a CI platform for mobile apps. And so our process is that we're very, very focused. Like everything that we build is like, what is the end user experience and what's the problem we're trying to solve?
Yeah.
Like that's how we start. And we sit down with like UX and design and we go through Figma and tear it apart a million different ways. And then once we have conviction that that's relative to the problem, the right solution, we go and build it in kind of almost a technology agnostic way during that
Yeah.
evaluation process. We go and build it. And so you mentioned, Unblocked as an AI company or AI dev tool or what have you. Honestly, we we don't see ourselves strictly as that way. This is just the technology that solves this problem in the
Yeah.
best possible way right now. But we start with the user experience, then we build the technology, and then we actually use it and almost inevitably realize that we were wrong in terms of like some of these edge cases or some of the things. And we go and iterate on it. And then once we feel good about it, we release it. What
Yeah.
does AI do? Just makes that REPL loop a lot faster.
Ah, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like an augmentation of what people do in a way that is embedding all the steps and transparent rather than you pick one step and now this is done by AI. I mean, we're not there yet. We're not there with automation or just removing humans from the loop in this or that.
I think again for the certainly today, I think for a lot of the mundane kind of boilerplate, well-known tasks that no one likes to do, things that require relatively no creativity, I would argue don't need to be done by people anymore, right?
Mm.
Like the idea of picking up a nail with a hammer and putting
Yeah.
it into a board is kind of like crazy. Like everyone has a nail gun. Like use the nail guns and just get your work done faster.
Yeah, I agree. So thank you, Dennis, so much. Thank you again for coming to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. If you found this chat valuable, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find the show. You can find all past episodes and learn more about the show at refactoring.fm. See you in the next episode.